Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's second day of the conference. This session is Leaving No One Behind, Community-Driven Innovations to Improve Livelihoods of Indigenous People in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Orachot Napasintuwong. I'm from Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at Kasetsart University here in Bangkok. I proudly introduce you our speakers here. But before that, I would like to give you a brief introduction of our session. Today, I will be moderating the session, and this session is joint between International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, and Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, or APR. Currently, APR and Eval Indigenous is working together in Asia Pacific to do research, indigeneity, and decolonizing evaluation to the development of a toolkit for indigenous evaluations, basically to amplify indigenous evaluation project practice by creating the voices of indigenous knowledge holders and evaluators, and to strengthen creative partnerships by providing seed funds for collaborative projects and encouraging peer-to-peer collaborations. IFAD, as you may know, is an international financial institution and a specialized agency of the United Nations dedicated to eradicating poverty and hunger in rural areas of developing countries. One of the projects financed by IFAD was the second Cordillera Highland Agricultural Resource Management, or CHARM, in the Philippines, where 2/3 of the population belongs to various indigenous tribes. So project promoted and fund community watershed conservation, deforestation, and agroforestry initiatives, and other community infrastructure. The project also delivered a package of assistance, including extension service, microfinance to household in living in this region. The presentation will show the results of an impact evaluation survey conducted by IFAD to assess the impact of the project on the livelihoods of indigenous households. In this session, we will have two presentations, and each will be followed by a discussion. First, let me introduce our first speaker. The presentation, the first one would be Stop, Look, and Listen, Insight on Culturally Responsive Research and Evaluations from Indigenous Communities and Evaluators in Asia Pacific, which will be given by Radhika Demal. Radhika Demal is the manager of APR. He's working on managing all APR programs, including implementation of the Asia-Pacific Regional Strategy in a systematic manner to advance evaluation culture in the region. He is a former board member of Sri Lankan Evaluation Association and co-founder of Evaluate Sri Lanka and Evaluate Asia. His experience is in quantitative and qualitative research methods, participatory evaluation methods, reaping effect mapping, agricultural value chains, project management, stakeholder engagement, survey development and administration, intercultural evaluation, and evaluation capacity. Please give us an applause to the presenter.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ora. So my presentation over here is on insights on cultural responsive research and evaluation from indigenous communities and evaluators in Asia Pacific. This is a project done with Eval Partners and Eval Indigenous, funded by Ford Foundation. And for the Asia Pacific region, Asia Pacific Evaluation Association is implementing this project. So this project is also going on in Latin America and Africa. And so part of this project, we are developing a toolkit. So part of that presentation is the title, as you can see, Stop, Look, and Listen. This is the kind of attitude we want to have researchers and evaluators working with the indigenous community have this kind of attitude when working with them. Okay, to get started, so this is the indigenous leader of Sri Lanka. His name is Vaniato. So they have lived in the island for 37,000 years. And he's the leader of 500,000 indigenous communities, indigenous people right now in Sri Lanka. So during our study, we interviewed him. And he said that there have been different organizations who have done research and evaluation with their community, but he's disappointed with the studies because it hasn't produced any tangible outcomes or results for their community. So he said that when working with indigenous communities, researchers and evaluators need to be genuinely committed to their causes, be ethical, transparent, and honest. So, and we have the barcode here. There's a video interview with him, which is part of our Eval Indigenous Voices project. Anyone can go to our website and watch the whole video. So based on that is why this kind of project came about with Eval Indigenous the main aim is to strengthen demand for cultural responsive indigenous evaluation practices. So for the Asia Pacific region, APIA is working closely with Eval Indigenous. So on your left-hand side is some of the activities we're doing, but for this presentation, I'm going to share we are developing a toolkit for indigenous evaluation based on some protocols done in Sri Lanka, Philippines, and a qualitative survey sent out in the Asia Pacific region. So these are the different activities we are doing. And finally, these are the initial findings we're going to share from the toolkit, but the main toolkit will be launched in a webinar in October and also then during the APIA conference. So to develop this toolkit, we did fieldwork in 2 locations. So one in Sri Lanka. So as you can see in the map, we went to 3 indigenous villages. One is Dambana, which is the indigenous capital of Sri Lanka, and then Ratugala and Polebada. And then the fieldwork was also done in the Philippines with the Ikalan community in the Visayas. And for this study, we use multiple methodologies. So participatory methods, and also we engage female, male, and youth indigenous people. And the Atlas survey here is a qualitative survey which was sent out to indigenous evaluators in the region to share their, because we're part of this project is creating a database also for indigenous evaluators and also to get the information about their experiences working with indigenous people. So I want to share some things that we heard from the indigenous people during this study and what we should think about when working with these communities. So the first one is stop. So before we go to these communities, it's important to stop because one thing they said to us is that when researchers and evaluators come to their communities, they gather data. After that, they never hear back from them. So because of that, there is skepticism towards researchers and evaluators. And another thing is that we have to also remember that the way of their thinking, the way they make decision and measure progress is sometimes different than Western frameworks, so that we also need to learn how to integrate their approaches in our studies. And that's why another thing is that also we must remember not to be extractive when we go to these communities. And the next one is look. So it's important that we respect the indigenous communities in their culture and understand the context. So one complaint we got from the indigenous leader in Sri Lanka is that nowadays researchers and evaluators, when they come and do studies with them, they don't come and get permission from their leader, which they find it very disrespectful. So for our study, we made sure, like they mean like go in person to visit them and go to their house and get permission. So one thing, that's what we did in our study. We went to the indigenous leader, met him, and got permission, and also got the community buy-in, because it's important to build that trust and relationship. Like I mentioned in the story of the leader, they don't have good impression of some of these studies that have been done, especially in Sri Lanka. So another thing is also in the Philippines, there's a moratorium against researchers coming in the Ikalan community. So in order to counter that, also our team got permission from the Indigenous Village Council of Elders in order to come here, because and also part of this project, the Ikalan community was one of the winners of the seed grant. So they will see some kind of impact, because they wanted to document a knowledge transfer activity of the intergenerational dialogue between elders and youth to protect their culture. So that's why it's important that we go there, and in order to get permission in Sri Lanka and in Philippines is a form of respect. So that's one example. And also we have to understand also to shed our stereotypes, because all the indigenous communities are not homogeneous. So in the Philippines, the indigenous community people are very well educated, they can speak English, so we can't think they're all hunter-gatherers as well. So that's something we can think about. So Erika will explain more going forward. And the last one is also we need to learn to listen. So we have to involve indigenous community members throughout the evaluation process, not just as the respondents in our study. So in our study right now, we have 3 indigenous community members from the Philippines working with us. So this is a way we build their evaluation and research capacity as well. And also in Sri Lanka, we have involved indigenous people in our study. Because the one thing they say is that they never hear back from the research and evaluate after this study. So it's very important also to disseminate the results. So we have worked closely on other eval indigenous projects with indigenous communities, where we have gone back and disseminate the results and worked with them on the recommendation, because they want to see some kind of change in their community. And also this is a way, because eval indigenous trying to promoting evaluation with indigenous communities to bring about change, is so they also get awareness about evaluation. So that's why it's important in our study also that we made sure we have indigenous people, and actually some of them will be coming in the APIA conference to share their experience. And so these are some questions I want you all to think about. This came directly from the indigenous people. These are questions they're asking evaluators and researchers before we come. So the first one is, what is the study all about and its purpose? From this study, how does it benefit the indigenous community? How long will this study be conducted for? What kind of data collection methods will be used for this study? Through collecting this data, will it harm our culture, especially once the report is published? So one indigenous leader in Sri Lanka said that the researchers have used their name to sell money. So like that, they have very bad experiences. So that's why this toolkit we're developing will be it will be also an advocacy tool and also a practical guide for evaluators, evaluation commissioners, and also even indigenous people once ready. So that's why when evaluators working and researchers in this community must stop, look, and listen before they do studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I will collect questions right at the end of 2 presentation and discussions. Okay. So let me ask, are you going to play video? No. No. Okay. Let me invite our discussant, Miss Erika. She's also from APIA. She is the board member of the association. So, Erika, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So thank you, Aura. I'm just gonna start and just say a disclaimer. Randika and I are not from indigenous communities, so it feels wrong for us to be the one talking about this particular research without the actual representations of the IP for this particular research. So for this particular one, I'm gonna spend I hope for you guys patience, but I have a 4-minute video here, but this is a video telling of the purpose and the importance of this particular research by an indigenous evaluator, and I hope I hope you would be able to take away from something from this video. So please.
I'm Fiona Cram. I live in Auckland, Aotearoa. My tribal affiliations on my dad's side are Māori with Ngāti Pahuera. And I'm a researcher and evaluator, and I run a small company called Katoa Limited, where we do a lot of what we call kaupapa Māori research and evaluation. And I think in those early days, there was this burden of how communities had been treated before by researchers that had left a really bad taste in their mouths. We heard lots of stories of communities sharing knowledge and never hearing back from researchers. We heard stories of when communities heard back about research findings, they were not painted in a good light at all. They were seen as people with lots of deficits, lots of problems that were personal rather than structural. And so when we went into community and said, my favorite line, we're here to evaluate, or we're the evaluators, we would sit with people who were like this, really not pleased to see us, angry, and thinking that we were there to misrepresent them. And you go, well, I actually really understand that. That seems like a really good defense mechanism. I mean, I love Sean Wilson's book, That Research is Ceremony. And I think if we said that evaluation is ceremony, it might make people pause more before they enter an Indigenous community. Because they'd go, what ceremony? How do I know this ceremony? Who do I need to take in order to? And then going, well, those are really good questions. And I think we have a saying here, which is part of the community art practices, which goes, te tero, whakarongo, kōrero. And effectively what is it saying is, first look. And I think look means really see people, be there with them and see them. And whakarongo is listen and learn to hear. I mean, I love really listen and hear people, attune your sight and your ear to people's reality. And then sometime later, you might talk. But it's that first space that's where when you go somewhere and you don't know the ceremony, you don't speak, you look and you listen, and someone invariably will guide you. And in looking and listening, I think also what we're doing is we're waiting for our offer to be the evaluator, to be either picked up or left sitting on the ground. That we should never think we have a right to enter a community. We should be in service of the community, and we should offer that service and let the community decide whether they would like to accept that offer.
So yeah, thank you for the secretary team for playing that. So that was Fiona Cram. She's the co-leader of the Eval Indigenous, and Eval Indigenous is
Fiona Cram.
Yes, thank you for reiterating that. So yeah, Eval Indigenous is supporting APEA for conducting this series of research essentially in Asia Pacific. And one of the, aside from the toolkit that Ranika was talking about earlier, one of it is the Voices Project, which is a series of videos documenting essentially the stories of indigenous evaluators and of the community itself with regards to the experiences in research and evaluation. So it's currently ongoing. It's being released. If this is something that you would be interested to see more, I would be happy to share it later after the session if you'd like to discuss. So, this is also a bit of a nod to to the customs of indigenous communities. Specifically, I mean, I'm not sure, of course, with other countries, but for Philippines, most of the traditions are orally passed down, and hopefully just through this series we are able to capture some of these stories and at least make it make it much more widespread and raise more awareness with regards to this particular issue. And I also understand that for many of you, this might not be something new, right? This is something that probably have heard multiple times before, but I want to reiterate that this is something that's already coming from the IPs itself. This is not coming from us, the researchers or the evaluators. These are words straight from the indigenous communities and the ones that they are demanding from us. So I think for this one, I'm not just calling for you guys to change your own methodologies, but I would also like to ask you guys to be also the advocates as well for this particular movement and for making sure that the voices of the IPs and the communities itself be well represented in our work, especially in evaluation, especially in the demand for more inclusive data with regards to delivering the sustainable development goals now that we are halfway through to deliver these goals. So yeah, and as Randika have mentioned, and I would just just reiterating the story of the Ikalahan community in the Philippines. The Ikalahan community in the Philippines is one of the success stories that you would consider for a very empowered IP. Ikalahan is the first community in the Philippines who are able to exert their rights in ancestral lands. It is also because of them that the Indigenous People's Rights Act was established in the Philippines, and it was also because of them, or they were the model community that the community-based forest management system was based from. And as any other success stories, these are the ones that are well researched, as you may know. And these are these are the stories that researchers love to visit and ask for for feedback, interviews, focus group discuss, whatever methodology that is. They're your favorite community. And they've been bombarded with a lot of research that they're really tired of it, to a point that, as Ranika have mentioned, they have developed a moratorium against researchers. It's just we're lucky that it's not yet officialized, that we were able to enter and ask for for their cooperation for this research, and that because they were also our partner as part of the Eval Indigenous Project under APEA, they were also a recipient of a project for empowering communities. So we had a leeway for us to be able to talk to them and ask for their cooperation for this toolkit. So this is why I also wanted to emphasize the toolkit that Randika have presented. We are hoping that this toolkit will be useful for everyone on how to properly conduct research, not just evaluation with the indigenous communities. And so hopefully avoid another case like the Ikalahan community. And as for how, I just want to flip the story and show how will this toolkit at the very least would benefit the IPs. For example, in the case of Ikalahan, the toolkit will definitely be something that's going to be useful for them in a sense that this is I'm hoping that the moratorium won't be too punishable, because they are a really great community to learn from. And I'm hoping that at the very least, the toolkit will make them, be more, what's the term, amicable in welcoming research, keep welcoming researchers, and it's the standard that they can use to ensure that they're still empowered through the evaluation process, that their voices are well represented through the data collection, and that they have actual benefits from the research. So yeah, that's all my points, and over to you, Ola.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm so excited to hear about the toolkit.
I'm so sorry. So I have more slides. I forgot. So the toolkit specifically, it's still ongoing. Just like because like for the caveats, for the Randika's presentation, it's also reviewed by. We have an ongoing, recently established community of practice for community ownership evaluation. So the presentations that we share to you guys, even these videos are reviewed by them and have received feedbacks from them. And then the toolkit is on process, and we are planning to launch it on October. So if you're interested, please just take a picture. I don't like printouts, so please take a picture of the QR code. So you can. I have more QR codes, so just take a picture. So it's a launch of the toolkit for the one that Randika has presented. So take your time. Let me know. I'm assuming. Just take a picture. The QR code is a registration link, so just hopefully save that in your gallery. And then for the whole results of the eval indigenous project with APEA, we are having a whole session about it in the APEA conference. And in both events, we would be having IPs from the Philippines to represent the research, and for them to be able to share their stories. So I'm just showing as well that there are many ways to engage the IPs in our work, and we don't have any excuse not to do so. So yeah, and then the last one, I have one more. Oh, and if you guys are interested for more discussions with regards to community-owned monitoring and evaluation research and learning, APEA has hosted the establishment of this COP, community-owned SMERL. And it's quite new one, so if you're interested in the discussions and what we've talked about, feel free to join. This brochure, you can download the brochure through this QR code. So I understand that the text on that slide is quite small. So yeah, so thank you so much, and over to you, Ora.
Thank you so much, Erica. So we heard the presentation about community engagement, indigenous people, and the toolkits, and we will come back for more details about this. But let's move to the next presentation. Our next presentation will be given by Dr. Vibhuti Mendirata. She is a senior economist in the Research and Impact Assessment Division of IFAD, where she is in charge of leading impact assessment of selected IFAD projects. Her key area of interest is to understand policies that can be best reached and help poor households and promote gender equality. Prior to joining IFAD, Vibhuti worked as senior economist in the Poverty and Equity Unit of the World Bank. She holds a master's degree in public policy and PhD in the economics from the Paris School of Economics. Her presentation today would be Second Cordillera Highland Agricultural Resource Management Project, or CHAM-2, in the Philippines. Vibhuti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thank you, Aura, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today to present some of the results from an impact assessment survey that we conducted in the Philippines on the project entitled Second Cordillera Highland Agricultural Resource Management Project, or the CHARM-2, which is what I'll be referring to it as I move along the presentation. Essentially, I just wanted to give a broad overview of what the Research and Impact Assessment Division does at IFAD. We measure the impact of the investments made by IFAD by systematically conducting impact assessments on a sample of at least 15% of all projects that closed during a 3-year replenishment period. Impact estimates on key indicators such as income, productive assets, resilience, market access are then aggregated across this 15% sample and projected to the entire portfolio at the corporate level using meta-analysis and meta-regression methods. For example, for the IFAD 11 replenishment period, which is the period between 2019 and 2021, 96 projects closed. We selected 24 in order to be able to assess the impact. And the Charm 2 project in the Philippines was one of those 24 projects, and that's what I'm going to present to you today, the results of the impact of this project on the beneficiaries. So very quickly, the Charm 2 project was partly financed by IFAD and other development partners, also contributed, including the government of the Philippines. It was implemented by the Department of Agriculture in the Cordillera Administrative Region in the Philippines. The main operations took place between the periods of 2011 and 2018. The Cordillera Administrative Region, or the CAR, is one of the most natural resource-rich parts of the country, but it's also one of these areas that continues to remain poor. About 2/3 of the population in this region is indigenous people. So essentially, the objective of the project was to improve the livelihoods of poor households in these indigenous communities through sustainable agriculture and agribusiness development, while respecting the natural resources surrounding this community, improving their land security, developing community infrastructure, conservation of watersheds, as well as highland forests. The targeting approach was designed for the project was designed to select villages in which IPs live, according to criteria such as poverty levels, access to social services, presence of ongoing projects, irrigated land, and potential for commercial activity. And just to emphasize, this is the particular area in the Philippines, the CAR, which was targeted by the project. There were 5 components of the project. And the first element were community-level interventions, which followed the principles of social mobilization and participatory planning of investments. And this is something that, in line with what Randika was also and Erica emphasized on involving indigenous communities. The project followed a very, very participatory approach. They mobilized indigenous communities in order to understand the needs of these communities and then plan investments accordingly. So that was one of the key highlights of the project, to ensure that there is acceptance, there's buy-in within the indigenous communities for the project. And based on this, there were investments planned in various aspects that I already talked about in terms of reforestation, agroforestry, land titling, and so on. And overall, there were about 188 villages that benefited from this program. At the household level as well, there were certain interventions in the former farmer field schools, learning visits, seed money for small economic activities. So some income generating activities as well. The total financing of the project stood at about $60 million US. And the largest component of the project was community infrastructure, which is essentially farm to market roads, footbridges, small warehouses, and solar drying pavements. All of this to promote the access to markets for the indigenous people and to promote commercial activity among indigenous people. So let me now talk about the survey itself, the impact assessment survey that we conducted. We wanted to, of course, understand the impact of the project. And in order to understand the impact of the project, we don't just interview the households that benefited from the project. We in order to understand the impact, we would like to observe one household in two states, one with receiving the project and one without receiving the project, but that's impossible, right? So we need to find households that look very similar in characteristics to the households that got the intervention, and then compare their outcomes. So essentially, in other words, the objective of the survey is to try and select treated or beneficiary and control or non-beneficiary households, while ensuring that both sets of households are comparable in terms of their characteristics, and such that the only difference between them is that treated households benefited from the projects and while the controlled households did not. This is not an easy thing to achieve, of course, and then I'll talk a little bit about the sampling strategy we followed in order to be able to get as close as possible to this. Ensuring that would then help us validate the idea that the difference in the outcome variables can be meaningfully attributed to the project, to the CHARM project. So let me talk a little bit about the sampling strategy. We conducted the survey between July 2021 and March 2022, so ex post, once the project had closed down. And we followed a multi-stage sampling strategy. Oh. The clicker doesn't seem to be working. It's not working. I apologize. Maybe, oh, you're gonna do it? Okay. Sorry. So essentially, the first step that we took was that we listed all the municipalities in which there was at least one village that benefited from the project, as well as there is the presence of a paired control village. That brings us to 28 municipalities with 96 treated villages and 204 control villages. We then, out of these 96 villages that benefited from the CHARM project, we selected 50 based on a proportional sampling strategy, which is essentially you're more likely to be selected to participate in the survey if you have a higher share of beneficiaries in your village. Out of the 204 control villages, we ranked them based on their comparability to beneficiary villages and then chose the top 50. So how did we measure comparability? We used GIS and Earth observation data, such as rainfall, precipitation, altitude, and a bunch of other variables in order to match. So we used propensity matching techniques to match the treated villages to the control villages. We ranked them and we chose the top 50. Then we, of course, had to go in these villages and select households, right? For the treatment households in the 50 villages, we randomly surveyed 20 households per village, thus an overall of 1,000 households that benefited from this, that were surveyed, I'm sorry. To choose the control households, we followed, again, a two-step procedure. First, we used the building footprint data from OpenStreetMap and Google Earth Pro, which is essentially a map of where all the buildings are demarcated. And what we did was we randomly selected 20 built-up locations per control village, and we asked the enumerators to go there to these GPS locations and administer a screening survey to make sure that the households that are finally selected to be a part of the control group meet the same targeting criteria that the CHARM project used. So this is essentially to ensure that the households that are selected as control are very comparable to the households that are selected for treatment. And hopefully with these steps, we were able to get a good match. And it is indeed the case that we were able to find beneficiary and control, we were able to select control households that looked very similar to beneficiary households. So these are a bunch of characteristics that, and I've plotted, what I'm showing here is the averages for beneficiary and control households and the mean difference. This lack of stars, so the only stars you see is on the livestock asset index, which means that's the only statistically significant thing. The rest of the variables, we see that there is no statistically significant difference between beneficiary and control households, which kind of validates some of the sampling that we did to ensure that we get a comparable control group. So I'm just going to quickly skip through this. We identified impact by using regression techniques. And what we did find that CHARM2 was in fact remarkably good at, as expected, of course, provided significantly high benefits, trainings, and loans, which were the main interventions of the CHARM2. So, for example, if you look at the orange box over there, the total number of benefits that treated households received was 11.7% higher than what the control households, or the households that did not benefit from the program. And we also observed similar things for trainings, of 69% higher number of trainings among the households that benefited versus that did not, higher loans, as well as 4% more households hold any document for a land parcel. So these are all very encouraging intermediate outcomes. These were the exact interventions that were rolled out by the project, and we do see that there was a large take-up. And then because there was a large take-up, not surprisingly, we do find good results on some of the indicators of welfare, if you will, for these households that benefited from the CHARM project. So first of all, for example, economic mobility, which is the overarching goal of IFAD. We measured this using gross total income. We see that there was an increase in 32% of gross total income for households that benefited from the project versus those that did not. And this was driven by both increases in income from crop farming as well as income from livestock farming. We also see increases in the likelihood, in the number of productive assets that the households own. That's probably because the intervention did provide for seed money to be able to engage in income generating activities. They're also have higher cropland, so it seems like that they have increased the area on which they plot their crops. In terms of productive capacity, which we measure through yield, we do not find any impact. When we look at market access, we do see that there is more, that households that benefited from the program are more likely to participate in the market, but we don't find any impact on the value of the sales, whether that's crop sales or livestock sales. So even though they are more likely to go to the market and engage in it, it's not that their sales are getting affected. We also see that there's slight, so in terms of resilience, we measure it in different ways. But what we find here is that the income diversification index has gone up, which means that the beneficiary households are more likely to have a diversified set of income sources relative to households that did not benefit from the program. And this seems likely because, as you can see, the income from livestock has increased, right? So it's possible that households are engaging more in livestock activities as a result of the intervention, and that has led to more sources of income for them. In terms of food security and nutrition, it's a negative because it's food insecurity. So food insecurity has gone down by 22% for beneficiary households, a good outcome. And in terms of gender equality, we don't find any impact on female-controlled gross income, but we do find some impacts on female-controlled livestock income and female-controlled market sales. Nevertheless, what I'm not showing here is that we found no impact on asset ownership of women. So even though they might be controlling some income, they are not really able to have any control over the assets. So there's limited impacts on gender equality, even though 50% of the beneficiaries were intended to be women. So overall, a mixed set of results, and there are some lessons to be learned from here. I'll go quickly over some of these channels of impact. So we saw increases in crop income and livestock income, and the increase in crop income does not seem to be driven by the yield rate, right? We saw that the yield did not improve. So it's not that yield is driving this increase. It's essentially driven by the increase in the percentage of households that are participating in crop farming, or an increase in the number of crops that these households are plotting, as well as higher engagement. And this is very important. There is an increase in the production of non-seasonal and cash crops among households that benefited from the project. This is something that's very important, as I will explain in the next slide. For livestock income, the increase is largely driven by increase in the percentage of households participating in livestock farming, as well as more livestock assets that are being owned by these households that benefited from the project. So just concluding, trying to draw some of the conclusions from these mixed bag of results that we saw earlier, we did find very good positive impacts on total income, driven both by higher crop income and higher livestock income. Higher crop income not driven by yield rate. It's driven by the idea that there is more likely, they're cultivating more, they have more land to cultivate, they're cultivating non-seasonal and cash crops. That's driving the increase in crop income. Higher livestock income, as I said, higher probability to participate in livestock farming and more livestock assets are driving up that. We also saw that beneficiary households are 13 percentage points more likely to engage in selling in the market. All of this points to the direction that there are some spillover impacts of the project. The project targeted crops. The project wanted to encourage access to infrastructure, of course, but also at the household level, the farmer field schools and the learning visits were all based on crop production. But it seems that there has been some spillover effects on livestock, as well as on non-seasonal as well as cash crops, which may imply that the development of infrastructure made it more lucrative for farmers in these indigenous communities to engage in activities that are not directly targeted by the program. And finally, some other conclusions. We saw there was improved food security, and this was largely driven by less likely to be worried about food, not eating healthy food, and eating fewer foods. The project had limited impact on nutrition, but it did not explicitly target nutrition. And we also know that to achieve changes in behavior with respect to nutrition requires long-term investments. Behavioral change is hard to come by. There is some evidence of improved women's empowerment, but the impact seems limited. We also found very limited impact in resilience. And that may mean that a more holistic approach to strengthening resilience may be warranted. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vibhuti. Thank you very nice presentation on the methodology and the evidence that you found in the Philippines. So let's move on to the discussion of the earlier presentation, and discussion will be also by representative from IFAD, Dr. Bidisha Baruth. She is the lead technical specialist and economist at IFAD, and she is leading work on promoting use of data and evidence-informed decision-making for agriculture under several projects and initiatives. One important is the initiative between IFAD, FAO, and the World Bank for strengthening national data system for agriculture. Very difficult acronym that I could pronounce. Maybe she could introduce you later. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Vibhuti, for the excellent presentation. I actually did not have the good fortune of reading through the entire CHARMS evaluation. So will limit my comments to what was presented. And I'm sure it's a much richer document that is there up publicly available for people to pick up and read. I completely understand and and fully admire the use of counterfactuals to really come up with an estimate of the impacts. This is, after all, an IFAD requirement. It's a corporate requirement. IFAD is a bank, and there is a need to know what is the rate of return on the investments that we do. What this project, what this impact assessment is able to do is give that precise figure of impact, a number on some of the key corporate requirements that really are important for IFAD's strategy. And combined with cost data, which is also available, I think this can really give you a good idea of what is the internal rate of return to your investments. So, really, congratulations, Vibhuti, for that. The second point that I really admired about this presentation has been the use of GIS data to develop and identify this counterfactual. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion around costs. I was moderating one of the panels, and the conversations went on and on about who bears the cost. It's too expensive, right? And here is a very good example of how costs can be saved. In an ideal world, I mean, or perhaps, if we were all perfectly mobile, this would have the selection of the counterfactual would have required you to be in the field, do a house listing, and then identify the households and even villages. So the use of GIS is truly a cost-saving method, and I think something that IFAD is investing in a lot. So I think these are really some of the merits of this impact assessment. Let me now, so that is really the economist in me speaking. I now want to just step back a bit and reflect overall on the evaluation design, on the study itself. So naturally, there's a requirement to report against the corporate, what is in the results monitoring framework for IFAD. Which are basically cross income, economic mobility, market access, productivity, gender equality. I was wondering if any effort were made to include also in this study some of the outcomes that really matter to the community. I mean, it does matter. In all of these matter. Income matters, sales matter. But there could be other aspirations or expectations that the community has from the project. And I was wondering if those have been included in the impact assessment. It may be also there in the report. So that would be really one good way to include indigenous voices into an evaluation, to really understand what is their expectation, how do they perceive that the project could impact them. The second point that I would like to make is around, was any information collected on indigenous practices, particularly practices around farming. And it seemed to me that the intervention itself was a pretty market-oriented intervention, which is what IFAD is also. It's part of our mandate, and I completely understand that. But there are indigenous communities engaged in practices that are very endemic to them. So where these studied in some way, and you did mention actually, Vibhuti, that crop production, the type of production that they were engaging in changed. So what, a more deeper understanding, a more nuanced understanding of these indigenous practices would just make this study a lot interesting, more informative for the communities. I think I would also like to know a bit more. I wonder how data were collected. IFAD has a very strong ethics, a board and an ethics clearance that is required, and I'm sure all of that was done. But to work with indigenous communities, as Rendika had mentioned, and I was really, I fully support you on that, is that there are certain norms around approaching the community, and I was wondering if those have been where we're really adhered to, and how. Linking back to the previous presentation, I really liked what you had to say, stop, look, and listen. And that is true for any community. I mean, it's particularly for indigenous communities that have their own identities that need to be protected and actually strengthened. So I think this is a principle that for me, I think broadly, I would take back home to IFAD and try to really have a conversation around this. The last point that I had to make was around reflexivity, and this is something that I think we as evaluators need to take more seriously than perhaps quantitative evaluators do. Is what is my position vis-a-vis a community that I'm going to evaluate? Essentially, to really be able to understand my position of power, that I bring my own lens because I am an urban educated woman, perhaps going to study a community that lives that is socially far away from me. So where are my perceptions coming in? What is my position vis-a-vis the community that I study? It is also one of my, something that I'm really trying to bring into the quantitative impact assessments that we do, that to really understand where do I stand vis-a-vis the people that we view. So really, this is not a comment on this particular project, but to really think more carefully about us as evaluators. I think those were my main comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vidisha. Vibhuti, would you like to respond first? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Vidisha, for these wonderful comments. And yes, I think that what you mentioned about the use of GIS and Earth observation data, that we were kind of operating under the context of COVID, right? When we started working, we didn't really have the luxury of going into the field to do a complete household listing. And that was the main motivation. It ended up being also very, very cost-saving technique. But sometimes I think we don't think outside of the box enough until we are really pushed into a corner and forced to think outside the box. It's something that also helped ensure a very credible counterfactual, actually. In some ways, it was better than a household listing, because sometimes in household listing, in these very forested areas, it's very, very tricky. It's very, very time consuming. So I think the use of GIS data was very, very important in a lot of different ways. To respond to some of the questions that you have raised, I think the project team that designed and implemented the project was, of course, the government itself, the Department of Agriculture, with support from IFAD. And there is this huge push to ensure that the indigenous communities' needs in terms of what they would require as investments, what they feel or think are the limitations that they are currently facing. All of the interventions that were planned were together with the communities themselves, whether that's community infrastructure, whether that is agroforestry, forest management, natural resource management. These are things that are very important to the indigenous communities in these forested highland areas of the Philippines. And there were investments made in those areas because they were identified as the areas in which investment was needed by the communities themselves, right? So there was a very, very participatory approach that was followed to ensure that they are engaged in the planning of everything. There was a lot of social mobilization as well that happened. Quite a significant chunk of financing was spent on social mobilization and participatory planning, about 10% at the outset of the project. That's a significant chunk of money to ensure that there is participatory planning of investments. So I think that by doing that, of course, we had a lot of buy-in from the indigenous communities to also do the survey. They were interested in understanding what were the results. And at the time of the survey, the villages that were selected, the enumerators, which was again CERCA, which is at the University of Philippines, the local research team went into these indigenous villages and sought permission before starting the evaluation. They were very well aware of the project, they benefited from the project, so they were also very open to participating in the surveys. So it was also very participatory, the way the evaluation, the survey was conducted. And lastly, on your question relating to the perceptions on the kinds of farming and that indigenous people engage in, actually in the survey itself, we do have a bunch of modules dedicated to understanding the type of agroforestry practices that the households are engaged in, the type of forest management, natural resource management. And there is a report which is available online. And you can look at it and all the results are in there. And those are, I presented the broad level results in terms of the total number of benefits received. But if you break these down, you will see that there was an improvements across the spectrum of activities that were conducted by the project, whether that's agroforestry, forest management, and so on. And I think that you can find that in the reports. I also wanted to say that we measure other things as well, which I have not presented today. So for example, subjective well-being. I think that's kind of, you were talking a little bit about perceptions. So I wanted to mention that there are questions on subjective well-being, how they perceive their own well-being to be. So we do have all of these different indicators in the broader report, if somebody is interested to look at them. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. I think we've seen two presentations and two excellent discussions. On the very first one, maybe focusing on the indigenous group and how to engage them and involve them in your evaluation. And the second one is perhaps more quantitative, which we are more familiar with as economists. But let's go back and give your participation as well to include any comments, questions, or reflections from the audience in this room. We have one here and one here. Let's go here first. มีไมโครโฟนไหมคะ Could you please kindly introduce yourself and go directly to the questions or comment?
Thank you. My name's Ivan Scott. I'm with the FAO regional office here. Thank you. That was really, really interesting, and two very different stories and approaches coming around the same theme. The thing I'm struggling with is reconciling what the initial speaker said on the extractive nature of research and then the use of controlled groups with indigenous peoples. And I just wondered if we could speak a bit more about some of the dilemmas that you faced with choosing a control group method, and then some of the measures that you put in to try and make sure that that was being responsibly done. Thank you.
Let's collect another question or two before we give our panelists the chance to respond. Yes.
Hi. Yes, I'm Miguel Paje from ID Insight. My question is actually very similar to the gentleman's earlier. So, randomization, randomized control trials are currently like at the forefront of what we do as impact evaluators, and randomized implementation, of course, means leaving some treated and leaving other communities untreated. So, do you think that this need for rigor poses the ethical concern of possibly denying beneficial treatment to beneficiaries? And again, like, how do you think this could be mitigated or balanced?
Thank you very much. And last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Jane Mwangi. I'm the Regional Evaluation Advisor for UNICEF here in Bangkok. Thank you very much. Very useful presentations. The first one, I think it's really a good reminder. Stop, look, listen. It's also a reminder for myself of what we need to do to better engage, of course, the indigenous communities, but I think communities in general. So I think that was very useful. On the presentation of IFAD, very useful, and I think what I'm taking away is it is possible to do these very rigorous evaluations if we better plan for them. My question is, one, why impact assessment and not impact evaluation? The other one is related to whether or not there was a baseline undertaken for this project, and what was seen as a difference, between the 2 or 3 assessments undertaken. Then, of course, I'm assuming there was, of course, also a theory of change and how that was taken into consideration during the evaluation, and whether you really needed to reconstruct that and so forth. And then finally, Scott has raised an important issue in terms of just this aspect of considering when we are thinking about control groups, especially when we are dealing with marginalized communities. So how do we select, and the ethics behind it? And finally, it is really in regards to the component of not leaving anyone behind, and whether or not further disaggregation was undertaken, for example, to look at female-headed households and whether those ones were faring better than the general population or not, household with disability and so forth. So kind of just like getting a better sense of what else was done to make even this assessment even richer in regards to policy direction and recommendations. But overall, very, very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the 3 excellent questions. We come back after the responses? So go ahead, Vibhuti.
Thank you. I think all 3 questions are very, very linked. So I'll try to frame a response that I hope to get to all 3. So I'm sorry, I didn't get your name from ID Insight. Miguel. Yeah. So Miguel, I think I'll start with what you mentioned about randomization and RCTs. So just to clarify, the project basically came into being around 2009, and the activities rolled out starting in 2011. That time there was no evaluation, no baseline, no midline. The only thing we did was that the project ended activities around 2018. The financial closure of the project was sometime around 2019. And then COVID came in, so we had to give ourselves a year pause, and we did an evaluation ex post. So we never had to deal with this thing of who gets treated or not, because that was already, there was a targeting criteria that was set together with the Department of Agriculture in the government of Philippines to understand where this project should be targeted within the Cordillera Administrative Region. So the idea that IFAD or the evaluators decided where the treatment would go was never existed. It was the government within this administrative region on certain identified criteria, which I think I briefly mentioned in my PPT, were poverty levels, were access to social services. So based on a bunch of criteria, some communities within this region were selected to participate in the project. And once that was done, we went in ex post to do the evaluation, to do the survey, impact assessment survey and not impact evaluation survey, because as you said, Jane, we call it impact assessment because we have an evaluation office as well, which is the independent evaluation office of IFAD. So we didn't want to muddle the two things, so we called ourselves the impact. That's what I understand. Maybe Bidisha, you have a different understanding, but that's where I understand the name impact assessment came from. And I think that the idea behind the survey was essentially to respond to this, of course, this corporate target that IFAD has set for itself to assess, to do impact assessment surveys on 15% of all projects that close. And this project in the Philippines was chosen randomly as one of the projects to do the impact assessment. Now, as I said previously, the project was rolled out according to certain established targeting criteria. The Department of Agriculture went into these communities, and it was in a participatory way that they decided where the roads will be constructed, where the watersheds will be developed, where all of the different investments would take place, right? It was decided that some areas needed some of these investment more, even though there are other areas where indigenous people live, but there was a decision made as to where these investments would go on behalf of the government, depending on the agreed established criteria that I mentioned, right? So, and the ex post survey basically wanted to get a sense of the areas that did get the intervention. How well are they doing? How much more better are they doing as a result of the intervention as compared to the areas that did not? So in order to select the control group, the team, the data collection firm that we worked with at the University of Philippines, Los Baños, essentially they went into these communities and made sure the enumerators were from these indigenous communities, because they had to speak the local languages and the interviews were conducted in the local languages. So these enumerators, when we selected the control group, of course, before doing any impact assessment survey, we do need ethics clearance, and we did get that. And to select the control, once the control group was selected, we did go into the enumerators went into these villages to seek permission from the heads of these villages to ensure that there's buy-in for the survey. So we really made sure at different steps of the process that the communities were engaged, that they knew what was happening, they knew the objectives of the survey. When we conduct the survey, we also make sure that there is there is a form that is signed where they understand that their data would be used for research purposes. So there were different steps that were taken to inform these communities that this data is, for what reason are we collecting this data, what purpose it will serve. There was and the ethical board clearance that, of course, we needed and we got. So we did make sure that we ticked all the boxes to make sure that we had all the clearances we needed to go ahead with the survey. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Erika or Marika, you want to also?
No, because I'm starting to realize, as we had a success, like when we interviewed in Kalahan, we asked, like, have you had an experience where, like, there was a research conducted in your community and it, like, benefited the community? And it was also through UP Los Baños. And they also said that they were able to require ethics permit from the board. And, like, they really liked it because first, like, yeah, as you have mentioned, like, they also, they got the conducting of the data gathering was conducted by the members of the community itself. And this is what we were saying, where you need to look better at the communities because they are capable. Some of them you don't even have to train or capacity build to conduct these activities. Like hell, some of them have higher level of education than I did. So it's just like balancing rigor with cultural responsiveness in these kinds of activities is possible. We're already in a new, a new stage where new challenges are emerging, and it's no longer like the challenges that we are facing before, wherein these communities are not aware of what we are trying to do. They understand that these researchers and these activities would benefit them. It's just that now they're asking, how is it going to benefit us? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question to Vibhuti, because your project is 8 years, right? 2011 to 2018. So, and interventions are various, correct? And I suppose that not every single household received the same intervention. So how do you take this into account?
So as I was saying, as I presented earlier, about 55% of the interventions went with development of community culture, and the remaining, the farmer field schools and trainings and so on, we capture very well in the survey that we conducted what were the type of support that the household received. So whether that's training, whether that's loans, whether that's land title documents, because these were the different things that the project engaged in. Unfortunately, in order to be able to estimate the impact for these individual components, one would need a sample size of 10,000 households. The samples, we were of course constrained by COVID, but also by the costs that are involved in going to each and every household and interviewing them for 1.5 hours, right? So we decided to look at the overall impact of the project rather than focusing on individual components, because we just didn't have the luxury to do it. Our sample size was not ever going to be powered enough to be able to estimate the impact of each of these components. So we decided to have a look at the overall project rather than focus on a particular component of the project. And that's why we had this screening questionnaire that was administered to the households, where at least 5 of the 7 criteria were met to make sure there's some level of comparability. Because the beneficiary households, of course, they benefited from trainings, loans. Some of them received 2 or 3. Some of them are close to an infrastructure and got the training. Others only got a document for land title. So it's very hard to disentangle because all of the components are very interlinked, and we cannot. There is no way to there is a way to disentangle, but there's no way of conducting an impact survey that has a sample size that's powered enough to get all of that done. Yeah.
So let's come back to one more question here. And okay, 2 more here.
Hello, my name is Stuart Coop. I'm from WFP Regional Bureau here in Bangkok. I just wanted to follow up on this issue of land titling because, you know, the indigenous communities have their own governance and they have their own legal structures in their own, you know, historically. A lot of the times, since colonial times, these have been trampled on and buried, you know. So I'll be very interested to know, you know, what is the worldview that they express in terms of something like land titling, if that's basically seen as, you know, going into a sort of almost like a individualized privatization of land ownership type scenario. I don't know how that fits with the indigenous worldview. So that was just a small, interesting point that I could pick out.
Thank you, thank you. And another question? Oh, yes, please.
I mean, first of all, I should also comment on the first presentation. Excellent. Yeah, I completely agree with the approach. Yeah, but let me just ask 2 small questions. Right, I know there are a lot of big questions asked already. Oh, I'm sorry. Christoph David Weinmann of Protean Consulting. The The one question which interested me is you did ex-post evaluation. Could you talk a little bit about the baselines that you were operating on in order for people to estimate their income that has increased, or like how did you actually establish that difference between when the project began and what happened afterwards, right? So what were the baselines that we were working on? And then there was one confusion I had from the slides, that on one slide you mentioned there was 0 change in gross income, and on the next one it says there was a positive change. Maybe I misunderstood something there. Yeah, just to clarify.
Yes, thank you very much. The last question?
Hello, my name is Beck from Good Neighbors. I'm also working as an NGO worker and a researcher for those indigenous group in other countries as well. So for the first question toward the first two presenters, that I was wondering that you're working with the indigenous group with the different languages, right? So that I was wondering that how you deliver those research questions or interview questions in their own language, because in certain contexts that you have to actually you need a lot of triangulation for developing questionnaires. And also that if you train those field researchers or enumerators, that they are coming from the same ethnic groups or same villages, that if they get to know them really well, then you might not have a very neutral stance toward the conducting the research. So I would like to know your strategies. For the second presenters, that we've been also doing a lot of researches without a baseline or the absence of a baseline or midline surveys. So by regarding the project period and then the budgets, that I was also wondering that I was quite surprised that without those baseline data, that how you develop the impact evaluation questionnaires, and then how you kind of analyze and then triangulate those data coming from the strategies, including GIS. So that if you share any experience more further than the presentation, it would be delightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me give a chance to Vibhuti to respond first, and then we'll come back to you, Radhika.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. In terms of gross income, just very quickly, there was a 32% increase in total income, not 0, maybe there was a mistake somewhere, but income did increase by 32% over total income. In terms of the ex post evaluations, the question that you had, we do not have any baseline data collection, neither midline data collection. We only go ex post, and that's why I think what also Bidisha was saying, and what also I said, that the selection of the counterfactual then becomes very important, because the counterfactual, the control group that we are selecting, kind of represents the households had they not received the benefits. We want to select households that look as similar as possible to the households that benefited from the project but did not get the project, right? So we just, and that if we have enough credibility, if our control group or our counterfactual is credible enough, then we can attribute all of the change in the income to the project itself. If we think our control group is strong, is valid, is credible, we can attribute the impact through, of course, the employment of various regression techniques. So I didn't mention it here because I thought I would go too much into technical details, but we employed a bunch of regression techniques to try to control for various confoundable variables and so on. We used, our principal approach was you can read the report and you'll see that there were a lot of different approaches that were followed. We are also writing a research paper now, further justifying the credibility of the counterfactual, because really we invested a lot of time in looking at that GIS data and developing that screening questionnaire, following this multi-stage sampling strategy to get to a control group. We were very confident by the end that we had a very strong control group, and a lot of the balance checks and a lot of the analysis that we did, which I didn't present here, but we also followed matching techniques and so on, which gave us very good results in terms of the treatment and the control groups being very balanced. And so,
Vibhuti, if
yeah.
I may, you have also used the productive asset index of 2010, right?
Right. Yeah. So
you've
that's
also used that.
Yeah, so another element that I was talking about matching. So when we match households, we looked at baseline characteristics. So we asked households exposed. So in 2021, when we went in, we asked them a bunch of questions of how they were placed in 2010. That's when the project began. And then we did the matching of the households. And that gave us very strong balanced treatment and control group, gave us a lot of more confidence in our control group. So we've employed a various bunch of techniques to try to make sure our control group was strong, which then leads us to believe or makes us confident that this is indeed the attributable impact of the project on the beneficiaries. And on the impact assessment questionnaire, we normally, so because we have to, because it's a corporate requirement at IFAD to conduct impact assessments on 15% of all the projects that closed, we have a standardized questionnaire that we follow because we need to report on the indicators that are in the results management framework of IFAD. So for the broader part, the questionnaire is the same, but we have huge scope to adapt it to the local context. So that's what we end up doing. As long as we are checking off the boxes for those 6 or 7 main principal indicators that IFAD is interested in at a corporate level, we then adapted. So for example, in this case, we asked a lot of questions on forests, agroforestry practices, and so on and so forth, which we may not ask in another project, which is maybe value chain development project, right? There we want to understand how the value chain is working. So we ask more questions on those aspects. So that's how we kind of, it's a broad overview of how the questionnaire was developed, but I'm happy to also talk to you bilaterally in case you want to know more. On land titling, very, very tough. I kept it for last because I actually did, as part of my PhD, I wrote a paper on a land certification program and its impact in Benin. And I actually showed that the government enforcing a land certification program actually led to worse outcomes for women, because men kind of became nervous about this joint titling initiative, and then they basically evicted the women from the land. So I understand the concern that you have mentioned. In this case, since the project was very participatory, as far as I understand, because I was not there at the time of design and implementation, as far as I understand, there were some concerns expressed by the indigenous communities on land encroachment by neighboring communities and so on. So that's why this element of land titling was introduced. And as I showed, perhaps I didn't show, but the land titling was a very, very tiny component of the entire project. So I'm not, it was a component, but it was not something that was universal. It was demand-based, so you could come and request for it, but it was not imposed as such. I'll stop there. I know we have a minute left.
Yes, thank you, Veronica.
Thank you for the questions. Stuart, in terms of in Sri Lanka, in the indigenous community has been relocated from their original lands because of development projects. So the lands that they're staying now, they want land deeds. They're fighting for their deeds because now they're in communities where the majority races are. So they want their land deeds for their houses. So that's one issue. They're working with the government officials there to get land deeds for their own houses. And in terms of the question in terms of language, so unfortunately in Sri Lanka, the indigenous community's language is dying. So the younger generation also don't speak it anymore. They speak the majority language because they have been sent to schools that teach that language. So they are speaking that language. So when we go to field work, normally in Sri Lanka, it's our team that goes. So I also go, I do most of the interviews. And they speak the local language. But like I mentioned in my presentation, we have people from the indigenous community researchers also assisting us. So what we do is when we develop our interview protocols, we first do pre-field visit. We go to them, we meet with the leaders, we meet with the community members, we have and we go over the questions with them. and we get feedback, and we refine our questions according to their languages and how to ask them. So we go there and try to understand their context as well. And then we also have indigenous team members part of our project. So normally for interviewing, we prefer the main core team members do it rather than we don't use enumerators. Because our study is mainly qualitative. So then we can get rich information, and then also it's better because in the pre-field visit, we have built that relationship with them, and then they are more comfortable to talk to us when we go for field work as well in the Philippines.
Yeah, sorry, just like one last to add as well with regards to the topic on the land titling. For the Philippines specifically, the impact of it. Of course, there are ancestral lands, and then portions of it are titled to the indigenous members. But one of the issues that they are facing right now is that the indigenous members some of them are selling it to outsiders. Usually, they're not allowed, of course, to sell it to non-IP or indigenous people. But like what they do is they adopt the buyer into their family, and that's how they are able to transfer the land. So that's one of the issues facing right now, and it's actually a conflict between the elders and the younger population within the IPs. And we were able to uncover just that during our site visit in the Philippines. For the Philippine context as well, because for the data gathering, the questionnaires, it's very different from the context of Sri Lanka, where, as I've mentioned, the IPs are very well educated and are very fluent in English. So when we were developing these questions, we weren't too concerned of translating it into their local language, because they are they are very familiar with English as well, and we could have talked about it in our our national language in Filipino. But to ensure that there's nothing lost in translation, this is the importance of engaging another IP member into the data gathering. While we are doing the key informant interview, we've invited another member of the IP, a young person, to join the interview. Although they are not participating as the interviewee, they are able to help, especially when we were talking with the elders. They're able to help translate some of the questions that might not be translating well into the local language. So that's one of the good practice, I suppose, that we have been able to do and discover throughout that process. So I hope that's helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much for our great presenters. And I would like to conclude this session by thank you everyone in this room for excellent discussion, very rich. And I think we can continue at the coffee break. And I would like to thank all the panelists here, and for all of those who see the importance of indigenous groups and the importance of taking them into consideration of impact evaluation. Thank you very much.